Heidi Beirich, thank you so much for joining us on the interview and the Islam Unravelled podcast and webinar. And you have such a rich background, especially in a very critical area, which is this area around racism and discrimination, and now hate and extremism, which is sadly more prevalent now than ever. Now, please, if you could, for those that aren't aware of yourself and your background and your work, if you could introduce yourself and we can start from there.
Sure. So I'm Heidi Beirich. I've been working against hate groups and extremism, I don't know, more than 20 years now. I worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center for 20 years, from 1999 until 2019. And while I was there, I directed a division called the Intelligence Project, which is the specific part of the Southern Poverty Law Center that tracks hate groups and extremists and produces journalism about them and trains cops on them and everything related to groups that are bigoted or racist or white supremacist was what we covered in the United States. And about a year ago, I left the center to start a new organization with a former SPLC colleague of mine, Wendy Vi, called the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. Our new organization is patterned on the same kinds of work that we did at the SPLC, so tracking hate groups, tracking extremists, but we're now looking at this from a transnational and international perspective, because white supremacy in particular is no longer something that just exists within the boundaries of the United States, or, as you all know, within the boundaries of Canada. These are movements that, really don't have a sense of borders. They believe themselves to be part of a white tribe. So that's the reason for the shift in my work.
And Heidi, in our previous conversation, you mentioned that you joined the SPLC in almost every department, every role over the last 20 years. And how did you get, your personal journey getting to this stage, and your personal mission and vision as to how it's evolved since you've, maybe you could talk about your journey to SPLC and beyond.
Sure. Well, to some extent, it was a fluke. I need to be honest. There were steps, like I guess for all of us along the way, where you catch a lucky break or there's an odd turn in the road. But I had been studying for a long time. I have a PhD in political science from Purdue University. I've been studying authoritarian governments and extremism as a PhD candidate and undergrad for a really long time. I think the first class I took on terrorism, I was a freshman at the University of Pennsylvania, actually. So I was always interested in these issues, and I wrote about, for my dissertation, I wrote about how the Spanish Constitutional Court helped to dismantle the legacy of Franco, right, the longstanding dictator there. So I was always interested in authoritarianism, extremism, military governments, and so on. But I thought when I was graduating from Purdue back in 1998 that I was probably going to become a professor. I had done some nonprofit work, as a volunteer, as a sideline, especially working with human rights groups. But I thought I was going to go to a university. And so when I started applying for jobs, my husband and I at the time were trying to get jobs at the same university. That is always difficult. We were in different fields. And he landed a job at Auburn University in Alabama. And I had this kind of epiphany. I was like, wait a minute, Southern Poverty Law Center is in Alabama. I'd never been to Alabama in my life. I'm originally from California. And I knew about the SPLC because when I was in high school in a town called Vista, California, which is sort of north of San Diego, there was a hate group up the road called White Aryan Resistance, a pretty despicable group of people that were actually recruiting kids into their skinhead world while I was in high school. And I had actually a brother of a good friend who got sucked up in that horrible neo-Nazi world. So I sort of kept my eye on SPLC. They had sued this group. They put it out of business because members of the group were responsible for beating and killing an Ethiopian immigrant in Portland back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So I knew about them. So I went to their website. Back in the late 90s, websites were pretty crude, but they did have an advertisement for an internship. So I just called them up and they hired me as an intern. I don't even think they had a position for me. This was really for kids coming right out of college. So I got there, and I just was very quickly hooked on the idea that, wait a minute, if I do this reporting work and I expose these people who are so heinous and against everything I believe in, right? Their views, I think white supremacy is, one of the worst things mankind has come up with. Well, I can have a direct impact on these movements. And in the first year I was there, we did some very good work, myself and my colleagues, exposing anti-immigrant networks in the United States, some of which are still functioning today. We were able to get a leader of a neo-Nazi group called the American Friends of the British National Party deported from the United States. And that activist angle and being able to really do something about these movements, it hooked me. And so I stayed, right? And then I eventually worked my way up, like I told you before, through every position in the department, and made my way to the top, right? To the directorship maybe about 10 years ago. So that's how I got there. And it got its claws in me. I wanted to do everything I could to stop white supremacy, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim thinking, anti-immigrant, all these things that are so harmful in terms of domestic terrorism, violence, but also just harmful to people's ability to live their everyday lives as they have an absolute right to. And so that's how I got there, and that's why I stayed.
Well, it's great work and important work and necessary work in this day and age. And now, just back to the Southern Poverty Law Center, it's based in Montgomery, Alabama, which is just about an hour drive from Selma, which was in the 1960s a very famous location where Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and other prominent Black activists were fighting for civil rights and anti-Jim Crow. And was that part of the reasoning for the location of the Southern Poverty Law Center, because of it being a hotbed of racial tension and racial divide?
Yes. I mean, to be in Montgomery, Alabama, where I lived for many, many years, is to experience civil rights in a very visceral way, right? Many of the battles, oftentimes violent, that occurred over advancing civil rights in this country happened there and in Birmingham, sort of up the road in Selma, as you just described. And the SPLC was founded by two Southern lawyers from Montgomery, and they put it there intentionally because they wanted to continue. This was in 1971. They wanted to continue the battle for civil rights. At that point, we had voting rights legislation. We had the Civil Rights Act passed. And also, people don't talk about it much, but there was an Immigration Act that was passed in 1965 that ended racism in our immigration policies. Those are the trifecta of the civil rights achievements in terms of law. But just because you pass a law doesn't mean it's a reality for people. So what they engaged in through much of the 70s and into the early 80s was to sue state agencies, racist organizations who weren't following the law. They were instrumental, for example, in desegregating the YMCA, in changing the way people were elected to state office in Alabama. They desegregated the troopers. It was a whole bunch of cases along those lines. And that's why the law center was put in Montgomery. And that was the original intention. Over time, it came to take on a whole bunch of other activities, like the anti-hate work we did, suing hate groups in civil court to put them out of business. In 1991, they launched a program called Teaching Tolerance, which was to, address the education sphere and give teachers the tools they need, in terms of originally anti-bias education, but it became more sophisticated over time to develop into anti-racism education. But the original idea was, let's do something right here in the heart of the South that will make civil rights a reality, not just something on paper.
Absolutely. And in the United States, with the 13th and 14th Amendment, so promises were made, laws were enacted, but they were not implemented. And for 100 years, the fight for civil rights and personal heroes like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and James Baldwin and others that literally they died because not James Baldwin, but Martin Luther King and Malcolm X paid with their lives because of such deeply entrenched racism and discrimination, and people willing to kill because of these beliefs.
Absolutely. I mean, the United States, when it comes to our history on race issues, is a disaster. And, you know, let's face it, this country was white supremacist until those bills were passed that I was talking about. It just was. It was obviously more entrenched in the Deep South, but this problem existed in a lot of parts of this country, and people did die for equality. It's a tragic history that in some ways I think we have not yet even um, sort of dealt with, right? The United States hasn't gone through something like Germany did after the war, where they investigated their past and did something about it and changed their education system. I mean, really a reckoning on all these Confederate monuments that we have littered all across the United States didn't come until 2015, when Dylan Roof killed 9 parishioners in a black church in South Carolina. And, you know, there are pictures online with him with the battle flag. I mean, our record is sorely lacking when it comes to racial justice. And the events of this past summer with the protests after George Floyd was, you know, killed at the hands of police show how far we still have to go. It's a serious issue.
And you brought up Dylan Roof, and Dylan Roof, from reading about him, he's a young man, mental health issues, loner, some history of bullying, and maybe that is a common theme. But they tend to find a tribe or a network that have these type of beliefs, and then I think he did a Google search on white, black on white crime or something like that, and so. That video where he rolls into the church, he's there for an hour during the prayer meeting and sitting with everybody, praying with everybody, and then when everyone closes their eyes, he starts killing them. And I was just horrified. And then you look at this type of behavior, and fast forward to 2019 with the New Zealand massacre, which again, people online, they find their tribes on Facebook. They find people that believe in their way of thinking, and it reinforces and hardens their biases, and then this role that from your start with the SPLC in 1999 to now 2021, the internet, I think the initial intention was a positive intention, I hope, but now it's become a way for all these right-wing and extremist groups to gather, connect, mobilize, and spread disinformation very quickly.
The internet has been a horrific accelerant to white supremacy worldwide. Dylan Roof, as you said, was a sort of early example when we began to grasp what the power of the web would be in terms of basically radicalizing thousands and thousands, predominantly young white men, into these ideas. Dylan Roof did it through Google searches, but I think social media has been far more impactful, actually, because, you know, until the Charlottesville rallies here in the United States that led to the death of a protester, these were, you know, people chanting anti-Semitic ideas. The rally was held in support of Confederate symbology. It was, you know, packed with all kinds of white supremacist groups. Until that horrible weekend in August 2017, the web was basically treated like the Wild West. None of the big mainstream providers like Facebook or Twitter or things like PayPal, you know, they let their services be used by anybody, however, whenever. And as a result of that, they created an entire online universe. I mean, I can include gaming apps. There's all kinds of ways this happens, where people were spreading really noxious ideas. Probably the most dangerous idea, because it's connected to so many terrorist attacks, including Christchurch, New Zealand attacks, is this idea of a great replacement or a white genocide, that white people somehow are being replaced or removed from the countries that, you know, in this formulation they deserve to control, which are places like in Europe, the US, Canada, and so on. And they're being replaced by non-white immigrants. Oftentimes this has an anti-Semitic spin, right? This is happening at the hands of Jews. This idea is now rampant across the web and has inspired multiple attacks, inspired Christchurch, inspired the attack on a Pittsburgh synagogue a few years ago, the Tree of Life synagogue. the El Paso Walmart attack, which was directed at Latinos. Actually, in Pittsburgh, people don't realize this, but the attack on the Tree of Life synagogue was actually an attack on an office in the synagogue, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, because the attacker in that case had come to the conclusion that Jews were importing Latinos and immigrants into the country to wipe out white people. So it was actually about immigration, right? This conspiracy theory. This is really what this is. It's this great replacement conspiracy theory. But there have been 2 attacks in Germany, one on a synagogue and another on shisha bars where Muslims were mostly present. I mean, I could go on and on and on with these kinds of attacks and what we're facing. And I lay this at the feet of social media that has been too lax for too long with allowing extremist ideas to proliferate that have inspired terrorism. I mean, even today, YouTube is filled with videos about the Great Replacement by a particular white supremacist group called Generation Identity. That's the group that Brenton Tarrant, right, the New Zealand shooter, gave money to and corresponded with. And it's an outrage that this is going on. This material needs to be deplatformed.
And in your opinion, like we spoke to your colleague Richard Warman, or one of the gentlemen you referred us to in Canada, and this theory of the Great Replacement and Facebook and these other mediums where you'd have to work hard to find a lot of this information before the prevalence of social media. And I read your report on Facebook and all the various instances that it's been complicit as a platform for not stopping disinformation or taking down pages that are advocating for violence or advocating for extreme views. Now, this research that you did specifically on Facebook, please talk about that and kind of the research that went into it and the examples that you brought up, including Myanmar and the Rohingya genocide.
Sure. So my organization, Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, along with Muslim Advocates, which is a Muslim civil rights group here in the United States out of Washington, D.C., we produced a report jointly called Complicit, which is about exactly what you talked about, Facebook's enabling of anti-Muslim violence in many, many places. And we looked at, I think, 10 different parts of the world where offline violence was led from the internet, right? In other words, driven off of Facebook's platform. And it has been absolutely devastating for Muslim populations around the world. In particular, this has been an issue for me. I don't know how many times I've tweeted at Facebook, deal with your anti-Muslim hate problem. This is ridiculous. But in Myanmar, Facebook was fingered actually by the United Nations Rapporteur as having enabled the Rohingya genocide because they allowed Myanmar officials, in particular army officials, to orchestrate that genocide off of Facebook. And it wasn't like they didn't know it was going on when it was happening. In our report, we document how people kept telling them, you need to do something about this. You need to do something about this. In one case, a researcher on this issue actually went all the way to Menlo Park, California from Myanmar to throw out the warning signs, and nothing was done. As short ago as February 2020, there were anti-Muslim riots that happened in New Delhi in India that were instigated by politicians associated with the ruling party there, the BJP, and that led to dozens and dozens of deaths. Once again, Facebook didn't do anything. We saw the same thing in Sri Lanka, which was attacks on Muslims orchestrated off the platform. I could go on. This has happened in a lot of places. So Facebook, by not taking these issues seriously, and of course, it's not just about Muslims, there are other populations who are targeted as well, depending on the country. But for some reason, I just feel like Facebook, just when it comes to the Muslim issue, they just don't take it seriously. I mean, they were upbraided for this by their own civil rights audit, which came out about a year ago, and still haven't taken action. But Facebook has been responsible for allowing its platform to be used for mass killings all the way up to genocide. This is an astounding thing and should not be happening. And with all our engagements with Facebook, they are lacking genocide protocols. They had an anti-Muslim woman who posted anti-Muslim material on her own Facebook page as the head of policy in India. She finally stepped down this past fall after a campaign by my organization and dozens of others around the world, saying you cannot have this woman in charge of Facebook in India where Muslims are getting killed because of stuff on the platform. So there's a real rot when it comes to this stuff. And there's more than this. There's a lot of far-right leaders who have demonized populations in a whole lot of countries who are given a pass for newsworthiness. We could talk about Donald Trump here, to attack various populations from Facebook, and their material doesn't come down. And it's been a disaster for vulnerable populations around the world.
And it seems selective. It seems like, again, just looking at the board members of Facebook, the senior management team, even the lead investors, they represent more often than not white Caucasian individuals that, again, like any government, systemic racism in law enforcement, in education, in academia, in all these places, if there's no diversity in terms of ethnic and religious and gender representation, then the default is they don't necessarily understand the lived experience or really have any empathy. And as a result, it seems like there's not any priority. It just seems like some statistic of tens of thousands of people getting killed and injured, and trying to say, well, I had nothing to do with it, when in fact they had something to do with it with their platform. So in the response back, when complaints are made to Facebook or YouTube, what is the typical response? Newsworthiness, the First Amendment? What are their rationale? Why do they justify keeping that hateful content up?
Well, here there is a big difference depending on which platform you're talking about, actually. Like, for example, if you were asking me this question about Twitter, let's say 12 months ago, I would have told you Twitter was a cesspool with no rules, didn't apply any rules. I'd go on and on and on about how terrible it is. That has completely changed with Twitter over the last 6-8 months. They put in place some very strong policy statements. You really aren't supposed to be allowed to use hate speech on the platform. They've deplatformed a whole lot of accounts, including all of the generation identity people. So there's a lot of work still to be done. I mean, there's some prominent white supremacists on Twitter, which irks me greatly, but it's a lot better, like loads better than it was 8-12 months ago. The same is true of Reddit. People don't realize this, but Reddit is the largest website on the internet. Get your mind around that. It is huge with millions of users. And in 2015 or 2016, a colleague of mine at the SPLC wrote a story calling Reddit the largest hate site on the internet. It was disgusting. I mean, it was just filled with racial slurs. There was no distinction between Reddit and, say, Stormfront, which is the oldest hate site ever put up, and its motto is white pride worldwide. Well, Reddit has put a stop to all of it. They have deplatformed everything, completely rewritten their policies. I mean, it's an astounding shift. Facebook has done some, but not enough. Oh, and I should say, you asked this question about the First Amendment. When we first started lobbying tech companies to clean up their sites, that's what we heard. The First Amendment, etc. But the fact of the matter is that Facebook, Twitter, they're not the government. The First Amendment is about the government not restricting your speech. A private company can do whatever it wants as long as it applies sort of standards in an equal way. Just like if I owned a restaurant, I don't have to let a Klansman come in there and preach to me of his views, right? This is absurd. So the First Amendment argument was always heard. It was this kind of libertarian ethos until Charlottesville. And that's when it began to change. So let me get back to Facebook. Facebook continues to have serious problems when it comes to anti-Muslim hatred. I'm going to keep pounding that nail as long as I have to. On the other hand, they have done some good things. They've banned blackface. They banned Holocaust denial. They banned militias in the fall. They banned QAnon. Many people, including myself, would say too little, too late. By the time you were banning these things in November, all these people were riled up. Yeah, and they were going to end up at the Capitol, right? I mean, this was orchestrated off Facebook. But they made some steps. So I don't want to paint them with a completely broad brush about hatred. They've got a lot of work to do, but there have been positive steps. More needs to be done. And you have to look at each of the platforms in that way. One thing I'm particularly worried right now is there's a developing international infrastructure in the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism. Most people don't know what that is. They've never heard of it. but it's where tech companies come together to deal with terrorist content. And this started with deplatforming of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, of course, they're being pressured to deal with the #1 domestic terrorism threat in most Western European countries, the US and Canada, which is now white supremacy. And there's this great reluctance to treat that the same as Islamic extremism had been treated. And I'm very, very concerned that we're going to have some massive battle over this issue to make sure that white supremacy is treated on a par as other forms of extremism, because it's ridiculous to leave a loophole there. And I can just feel the backsliding right now by these tech companies not wanting to wade too deeply into this issue, unfortunately.
And do you find, like, worldwide now, with the reach of the technology companies are unprecedented? Facebook, between 2 and 3 billion users. So really, a lot of people are getting their news, their friends and neighbors and community tribes sharing their respective views online. It is creating an environment in which, in the wrong hands, it can be used very quickly for nefarious ends. And just like in a real riot, it's 10, 20, 30 of the initial instigators, and then thousands of people follow suit. And there's a documentary I saw over the weekend called White Noise, which was about 3 prominent white supremacists, Richard Spencer, Lauren Southern, and Chernowski. I don't know if you had a chance to see that one, but it seems like these individuals, they have a certain following, and they're able to disseminate it to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in cases, millions of people, and they may or may not believe in those views, but from that documentary, it seemed like some of these folks just like the attention. They like to say provocative things for views, for followers, and then to sell their vitamin supplements or whatever else they're selling, get donations. So it seems like some are opportunistic grifters and some are actual real racists, but they are able to kind of initially get people to watch their content. And some of these people, including the person in New Zealand, Tarrant, watch this stuff, reinforces their bias, and then some of these become radicalized to violence. And in this particular case, and we've invited you to speak at our event marking the 2nd anniversary of the New Zealand massacre, and that country has done quite a lot of work to kind of prevent, or plan to prevent, similar things from ever happening again. But Tarrant himself, 8chan, 4chan, and some of these groups online, Stormfront, these groups themselves, separate from the internet, are there other ways they're mobilizing or their mandates? Because I know a lot of them are actually advocating for military training, weapons training, many kind of preparatory things for potential implementing violence to immigrants, Muslims, and others.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. When we talk about Tarrant, I just have to mention one other tech company in particular, which is YouTube, which actually is a cesspool of hate. They wouldn't take any of the identitarian great replacement content down. And the New Zealand Royal Commission that looked at the attacks in Christchurch documents how Tarrant was radicalized largely on YouTube. So I'm always astounded that YouTube would leave up the exact content that inspired a person who killed 51 people in 2 mosques and injured many others. I mean, it's shocking and unacceptable. But as to the real world aspect, yeah, this last year we've been very COVID bound. People have really been online, which has meant that many of these groups have largely been functioning in that space. But they do have real world activities. So, most of the radicalization and the drawing people into extremist groups comes on the online space, but it eventually moves to the offline space. And what we've seen in recent months, for example, is that 1 in 5 of the Capitol insurrectionists were veterans of the military or active duty. There were others that were law enforcement officials. They had gotten sucked into QAnon and other extremist movements over the last few years, and eventually were willing to involve themselves in something like that. The most dangerous neo-Nazi groups, the ones responsible for a lot of deaths, like Atomwaffen Division, which means it's now has a new, they've just reorganized into a new group, but they were responsible for 5 deaths between 2017 and 2018, for example. A lot of their leaders were in the National Guard. They told their members to join the military. The same is true of another neo-Nazi group called the Base, which is actually the translation into English of Al-Qaeda, interestingly enough, but it's a Nazi organization. The Base had military recruits, including they had smuggled in a Canadian army guy named Patrick Matthews, who was arrested here in the state of Georgia, where I am, for an attempted attack on a rally. So you have this problem of infiltration of law enforcement, of the military. This is also true in other countries. Atomwaffen threatened politicians in Germany, for example, and Germany's got a big scandal going on with their armed forces having neo-Nazis in it. There will also very shortly, I think, be a return to, a lot of street protests and something that looks a little bit more like the anti-lockdown protests that we saw here in the United States that brought out the militias, the Boogaloo Boys. This is a group that wants to destroy, democracies around the world, especially in the US. We're going to see a lot of that. So there will be the online radicalization and recruitment that will move to the offline space. And in the worst cases, will result in some kind of violence, right? These domestic terrorist attacks, many of them that have been busted up. But I don't expect these trends to stop. The best thing that could happen would be getting all these people off the mainstream platforms for good. If they have to hide over in Telegram, okay, they can still share their ideas, their extremism, but they won't have that recruitment base, right? Those Dylan Roofs won't be sitting there, a feeble-minded character like Dylan Roof, ready and waiting to get sucked into this world.
Absolutely. And now systemic racism, and the great replacement theory, and a lot of your work has been racists that are quote unquote academics, or folks that are very well educated, and they present a quote unquote credible narrative in the way they present it, with selected facts, some outright fabricated facts mixed in with some facts, to present an argument to inflame a certain belief. And there are some of these folks that are also on YouTube as well, that they try and present, nice graphics and sort of factual historical kind of data, but it's very selective, and a lot of it's disinformation or half truths. Let's maybe talk about that. I don't know if you want to name any academics themselves that are specifically have this agenda of Islamophobia and anti-immigrant, because that is part of your research and work, if you'd like to talk about that.
Sure. Well, we shouldn't get the image in our head that everybody who's involved in spreading these heinous ideas is a skinhead, in boots and a shaved head, or is, a Proud Boys thug who wants to street brawl. There's a whole sort of suit and tie version of white supremacy and similar things that are out there in the white supremacist world. Let's not forget the guy who wrote the book The Great Replacement, who put this idea out, is a French academic, right? Raymond Camus. Here in the United States, we have Yale educated Jared Taylor, who runs a group called American Renaissance, who is the person who created the narrative about how blacks are rampaging and attacking white people that Dylan Roof came to believe, right? There have also been quite a few Holocaust deniers. There's one right now at Northwestern who are in faculty positions. And there's also a whole world of think tank types who push, in particular, anti-Muslim ideas and anti-immigrant ideas. These are people like Pamela Geller, right, who is connected with David Horowitz. David Horowitz, who runs the David Horowitz Freedom Foundation, which is where Stephen Miller, our resident nativist who created all the horrible immigration policies of the Trump era, he got his start with David Horowitz when he was in his teens. Horowitz has paid for a whole cabal of people who put out just hordes of anti-Muslim lies. Pamela Geller's one of those examples. There's Brigitte Gabriel, who runs Act for America, which has thousands and thousands of members and is on Facebook. She is responsible for incredible lies about Muslims, for example. And these are people who don't look like street thugs, right? They're dressed in suits, they're nicely made up, and they put a veer of sort of academic seriousness on their work, but it's not real. It's not real. This is just terrible stuff. Frank Gaffney, I'd have to mention him too, another Islamophobe here in the United States who's done a lot of damage in the way he paints Muslims. So we shouldn't just think about hate movements as being these kind of thuggish types. In some ways, the people I'm talking about in suit and ties and nicely dressed and nice haircuts, and they're more insidious, right? Because to the average person, they look legitimate even when they're not. A friend of mine even had her one of her kids cited American Renaissance. This is this white supremacist site in a high school paper because it looked so legit, right? Its website is a .org, which is true for a lot of these people, and it had this veneer of academic, seriousness. So anyhow,
And David Duke, he would obviously, being a former Grand Wizard of or current or former Grand Wizard of the KKK, Sam Harris and Daniel Pipes and a number of others. So maybe let's talk about those folks as well. Like they are published, they do have huge followings, and people are influenced by their writings.
yeah, well, when you say Daniel Pipes, I also think of Robert Spencer, who's connected to David Horowitz and puts all these books out, supposedly making a sophisticated interpretation of the Quran. And it's just childish insults, essentially, but it's all put together in a fancy way. Daniel Pipes is the same way, right? He uses sophisticated language. He publishes all kinds of articles and whatnot that are basically demeaning to Muslims and anti-Muslim propaganda, but he puts it out there as though he's serious and he's connected. I mean, a lot of these, in particular, anti-Muslim ideologues in the United States have had ties to conservative figures in the United States and people in the networks that rose after 9/11 to fight Islamic extremism. And I think they have become less and less credible over time as organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and others have pointed out that what they say is basically biased hokum. But they did have those connections, especially after 9/11, for about 10, 12 years after that. And it's a serious problem. David Duke is another one. He has a quote unquote PhD from a university in Ukraine where he studied, I don't remember exactly what it was. What it was basically something anti-Semitic, like Jewish supremacism, which is the name of one of his books. His books are sold worldwide, including at the Duma in Russia, where he
Russia.
lived. Where he lived for a while. And he has a certain amount of credibility in circles like in Ukraine and in parts of Europe, where he's treated as an intellectual. And he's not. And I should say, one of the things about David Duke that is the funniest things is I wrote a story when I was at SPLC about how one of his books is just a straight ripoff of another anti-Semite, this guy named Kevin McDonald, who was a professor at Cal State Long Beach for years and was pumping out all this weird stuff about how Jews are genetically driven to destroy white societies. I mean, basically the Great Replacement idea without putting a name on it. But there he was teaching classes. And in 2007, I went to Cal State Long Beach to talk to students to say, what do you think about the fact that your professors are raging anti-Semite and a racist? And it caused a huge kerfluffle. This is the activism that I liked, right? A huge kerfluffle at the campus, because how could you, as a student of color or a Jew, feel safe in that classroom or feel like you were being treated fairly, right? This guy literally wanted to tax Jews more so that they would have less access to colleges and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's just a lunatic idea. Thank God he's retired.
And are you finding that with the motive of these folks, like I was reading a book called The Islamophobia Industry by Nathan Lean, and he in the book he was talking about over $100 million is spent on Islamophobic content, and where's that money coming from? Like, is there money in racism where they can raise the money from sympathetic sources, and there's some sort of economic incentive to perpetuate this hate to keep donations and followers?
This is a very important thing that you're talking about here. So the Council on American Islamic Relations here in the United States, I think about 3 years ago, CARE, it's usually known as, put out a report that looked at how many foundations were funding the Islamophobia network. The Center for American Progress, Faz Shakir, who used to be the editor at their blog Think Progress, also did a report on this, tracking the money. And it was a little shocking how many big American foundations were pouring money into like David Horowitz's hands. I mean, I'm talking millions and millions of dollars. I can't remember what the totals were, but there was a network of, I don't know, 36 right-wing foundations who were spending millions and millions of dollars a year to prop up this essentially artificial network, right? These people didn't really have grassroots support, right? They had a few big foundations that were giving them big money to pump out all this anti-Muslim content. And everybody was connected to everybody in that world and to the same foundations. In fact, with a friend of mine who worked at CARE at the time, we launched a program to try to get the foundation world to stop giving money to hate groups. I could say something similar about the anti-immigrant world, where there's, in fact, in that case, one foundation that props up by more than 50% the budgets of hate-driven anti-immigrant organizations. And we're still sort of doing this work, trying to convince foundations you should not be giving money to hate groups. You are fueling the exact activities that are tearing the fabric of this society and destroying people's lives. And God knows philanthropy should have nothing to do with that.
And now even not only that kind of funding from foundations, but these large news organizations like Fox News and opportunists and business people like Rupert Murdoch, and the history of Fox News with Roger Ailes is the market that was underserved was the Middle America, the right-wing market. Up until Fox News was founded, CNN and MSNBC, CNBC, these were the primary sources of news, which were more left or center-left type news organizations. And his focus, Roger Ailes, when he left CNBC, was we are going to focus on we're going to focus on Middle America. We're going to focus on that voice that's not heard on cable news, and he went hard right. And in one of the documentaries, the preference was to have more or less all white anchors, white blonde women, and any kind of like other black or other ethnicities. At least in the documentary, he said that's not going to play in Middle America. And so with kind of that quasi professionalism, and obviously he's got 30-40 years prior to the founding of Fox News of a lot of deep history in television media. And so the role of Fox News in fomenting anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim rhetoric, let's talk about mainstream news and how that affects society.
Well, this is something that doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. We talk a lot about the online space, the social media platforms, and how they're driving radicalization. But there is a very good argument to be made that Fox News has been more damaging than that. And just a shout out to the movie Bombshell, and I can't remember Russell Crowe's,
the Russell
Crowe's,
that was very good.
Yeah, it was really good on all this. But yes, Roger Ailes turned Fox News into one of the biggest propaganda places for anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim thinking. And I think many of us would argue that Tucker Carlson, who's their big draw commentator, basically has been spouting versions of white nationalism for the last couple of years, including at one point the Great Replacement and other lies like South African white farmers are being killed in mass by black. It's just it's all BS, right? And Fox News pounds and pounds and pounds these issues. It allows hate group leaders from anti-immigrant outfits like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, anti-Muslim outfits like the Center for Security Policy, people like Brigitte Gabriel of Act for America, they get a platform there. Janine Pirro, one of their commentators, is constantly lying about the Muslim population and demonizing the Muslim population. And they have a lock on a certain segment of this country that watches absolutely nothing else. So they are indoctrinated day in and night out with these ideas. And there's a lot of arguments that could be made that, without Fox News, we wouldn't have had Donald Trump. We wouldn't have the conservative movement moving so far to the right and mainstreaming bigoted ideas and bigoted policies. You know, Stephen Miller probably loves Fox News for what it's done for him and for the anti-immigrant wing of the Republican Party. And, you know, nowadays, our Republican Party here in the United States, when political scientists assess where it sits on the spectrum, they actually put it with far right populist parties like the Alternative for Germany, which is an anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant political party in Germany that the state is now spying on because they're afraid that it's going to be involved in all kinds of terrible things, including inducing violence. Our Republican Party is more like them now than the Republican Party that I grew up with, for example, with Ronald Reagan. You know, you just wouldn't get this demonization and attacks on whole groups of people like you have today, or these heinous policies like the Muslim ban and everything that was done on immigration under Trump and with Miller's hand there.
And there's hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars in profits with that market, and that market is significant. The corporate advertisers, the viewers, in some cases, even much more than CNN or CNBC. The viewership is very large. And now even further right, like Newsmax and Breitbart. So these are becoming the go-to news sources for a huge segment of populations in the West. Now with Newsmax and Breitbart, they go even further right than Fox News. So in terms of Donald Trump and opportunists that are utilizing a certain kind of belief system for a power base, an economic power base, a voting power base. This is what the people want to hear. This is where the money is. This is where the donations come from. So it does seem like even the news anchors on Fox News, they're highly paid. There's a lot of money in this. And so they have to sell it hard, whether they believe these things or not, but they sell it hard. They like when I watch these shows, I was like, do they believe what they're saying? Or they're just so well paid. It's just like, well, I got to bring it. I got to put my game face on and I got to say what I got to say to get paid.
I mean, look, this is an ethical issue, right? And they have decided to throw ethics completely out the window in the pursuit of profit. And you're right, there's actually a lot more than Fox News now. We have Sinclair Broadcasting Networks here in the US, which pumps out all kinds of pro-Trump propaganda and propaganda to the right, in many cases of Fox News. And we have One American News Network, which is kind of like Newsmax and being very extreme. I like to, you know, I like to refer to them as OAnon, right? As though they're similar to QAnon with their conspiracy theories. But this is a market. And then we have all the far right websites, Gateway Pundit, Breitbart, Ben Shapiro's The Daily Wire, I think. I could go on. This is a whole ecosystem to itself. And what's interesting is when you look at how the American population interacts with these things, if you kind of map it out, you find a whole lot of diversity among what people read in terms of news sources and whatnot, from about the center right to the far left. But then there's this like glob, right, of everybody connected to Fox News, OAnon, Breitbart. It's like a little encapsulated universe where people don't experience other ideas. And it's a tragedy. It's a polarizing force. That's what Fox and these outlets have done.
And Heidi, you brought up QAnon, and you know, we were reading an article about how the New York Times, in a detailed research and article about Donald Trump's taxes, that was a heavy hitting news piece that was only shared 176,000 times at that time, but the QAnon craziness has been shared millions, 10, 15 million times. Like the shares for fake news, disinformation is much more than legitimate and real news. And as a result, these conspiracy theories, which have no facts whatsoever, are really hijacking the consciousness of people that love these sensationalistic stories and they believe them.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. There was no QAnon 4.5 years ago. It did not exist. And it started by one guy, Mark Cernovich, publishing a story about how there was a sex trafficking thing going on in a pizza place in Washington, D.C., run by a
Yeah.
couple prominent Democrats like Hillary Clinton. First of all, that's insane, right?
Yeah.
But it caused a guy to walk in there with a long gun and shoot off a round.
Yeah.
And then it eventually morphed into something that has an online presence of millions of people who are watching this QAnon stuff, right? That believe that this conspiracy is happening, that Donald Trump was actually brought into government to destroy these networks and to set the world right. And I mean, the beliefs are, they're really out there. But there's now millions of people who believe this stuff, and a bunch of the people who stormed the Capitol are connected with QAnon. And even though this fake Q character, right, who's supposedly behind all this and it puts out Q drops and information about the conspiracy theories, he hasn't posted anything in weeks. And yet these people continue on. And, we've had some people leave QAnon and talk to the press in recent months, especially after the Capitol storming. And, it's like a cult on steroids. I live just a few counties over from Marjorie Taylor Greene, our new QAnon
Wow.
congresswoman here in Georgia.
Wow.
And, she full on believes that. We have two people in Congress right now who are QAnon adherents. And when you get down to the state level in the GOP and Republican parties at the state level and county, you got a whole lot more. So the party itself has been affected by, somewhat of a QAnon takeover, depending on where you're talking about. For example, the Republican Party in Texas actually put a QAnon slogan up on their website. So,
Wow. So
and you can't believe
you
anybody would believe this stuff, right?
well, you may have coined a new phrase, Neo-Occultism. It's a cult. It really is a cult mindset, but it's spread online. They don't have to physically be in one place like Waco or wherever. It's actually an online cult that has these adherents that will follow whatever crazy nonsense. The crazier, the better. They'll follow it.
Yeah, and
Now,
let's not forget that the FBI has labeled QAnon as directly connected to violence, right? Murders and all kinds of stuff. So it's not just the storming of the Capitol. I mean, on the one hand, you hear QAnon and you want to kind of laugh at how ludicrous these ideas are. And then you look at the trail of dead bodies, frankly, and it's terrifying.
well, now broadening the scope much larger are foreign actors like state governments in China and Russia who have a vested interest in divisive politics in the United States. The more division in Europe and the United States, Canada, Western societies, and what are the fault lines? Just to kind of step back with cold, hard logic reasoning, divide and rule. Where are the fault lines? Where are the fissures? So black and white discrimination, gay, LGBTQ issues, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant. So as you're probably aware in your research with 2016 elections and prior to that, and maybe even currently, state actors like Russia and even China to a degree utilizing social media and to foment these divisions more so. A case in point, the Texas mosque creating an online kind of campaign for white supremacists to march against the mosque, and then a campaign for the Muslims to march against the white supremacists. So it was like folks that aren't necessarily racist, but they want to foment division. They want to foment anger and animosity toward each other and create this violence. So that's another factor that's driving this as well.
Well, I mean, inauthentic accounts. The incident you're talking about is really extraordinary because it was all completely organized online by Russian bots. There were no real people behind that,
Wow.
and it brought people in front of the mosque armed, right, against Muslims who were praying there. It was just astounding. It's like something out of a movie, right? How did that jump from a pure online thing to an actual real world event? Look, the use of automated accounts, disinformation, misinformation is corrupting elections all over the world. We saw this with Bolsonaro's rise in Brazil, with Duterte's rise in the Philippines. It's had, not just all the terrible stuff about COVID, which have had real life health effects, right? The lies about the coronavirus, but there is real distortions of political systems around the world that are happening because of social media and its inability to deal with these issues appropriately. So it's not just hate violence, it's also democracies, worse off, vulnerable populations targeted of all sorts. I mean, this has not been a good thing for the world, right? You know, social media started with this pie in the sky idea, like everybody's going to be together and it's all going to be good things, and we're going to share baby photos and we're going to help small businesses. And, you know, the problem was none of those tech leaders knew anything about history, civil rights, human rights, war, genocide. And they didn't think about, well, okay, maybe we can stitch families together better and people keep in touch, and those are good things and help small businesses and nonprofits. But what if bad actors use this? Because bad actors were always going to use social media.
Yeah.
And that was the mistake. It was the incredible short-sightedness and naivete and irresponsibility on these people who created these platforms without really investigating what could be the downsides. And, you know, what I get frustrated with is it seems to always take something horrible happening before you hear Facebook saying, well, we're on it now. Like, we're on it on the genocide thing after, you know, 750,000 Rohingya have been displaced and, you know, hundreds of thousands killed. Well, that's too late. That's too late.
And in our Western society, corporate profits and the measures and metrics of quote unquote success, increase of users, increase in profitability. So these are things that quarter by quarter, every company is judged. And so by having people engaged, regardless of the content, as long as the user engagement is high, the shares, the likes are significant, people are using this. So they don't necessarily care what the content is, because the user metrics and the advertising revenues that they generate are so significant, whatever it takes to cater to every kind of crazy group, just to keep those metrics and those revenues increasing. And so it seems like the economic incentive and the corporate incentive is one rationale as to why they're not doing anything about it. And then in their insatiable desire for growth in countries like India. So if they antagonize or they try and deplatform or take down anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant content, they may antagonize these leaders of these parties that could prevent them from growing or increasing their user base. So it seems like there's a cold, calculated what is in our best interests and what is our calculated long-range goal. If we let this slide, we can still generate X amount of increase in user base, that kind of, in our shareholder reports and in our economics for our advertising revenue. So maybe these calculations are factored into what they're letting slide in order for their corporate growth to occur.
Oh, there's no question that they've done this for profit. You've described it exactly right. And so then the question becomes, all right, well, who's going to stop you, right? Who's going to make you pay for the offline harms you're creating? Is it, at this point, I think it's going to have to be governments. You raised the issue earlier about diversity on boards and corporate responsibility issues. Unfortunately, when it comes to Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg owns that company lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, the board is almost useless, actually, has no ability because of the way he set up his shares to influence him. That's a real problem. But at other places, you do have this ability to bring up issues on the board, bring up things from shareholders, right? There are pressure points. And all of those are going to need to be done if they can't make the ethical and moral decisions to protect users and people from these harms. I mean, there's just no way around it. If it's just about money, then someone's got to step in and stop you from going down this road. And, frankly, at this point, I feel like Facebook, it has gone into these developing countries, become the internet, right? They provide free, all kinds of stuff, WhatsApp, web services. People don't even realize that there's a web outside of Facebook. And then they have that population captured. And that is just a terrible situation and easily manipulable with misinformation. Governments like the BJP in India and other places being able to sort of control that space because they know how it works. They know how to manipulate these things. I mean, maybe Facebook shouldn't be in these places. Maybe it's just too dangerous.
And would you say that international government, like the International Criminal Court or even the United States government, from knowing where the sources of genocide and murders and rapes and all kinds of havoc being wrought around the world using these platforms, in terms of legislation, in terms of laws enacted, maybe I know we're coming near the end of our time, and in respect of your time, maybe possible solutions, possible, some hope for all of us at the end of this conversation, that we are hopeful that things will change, but perhaps let's close on that note of how we can get government and other international governing agencies to address this and hopefully provide solutions in terms of laws.
Well, there is a new online harms bill coming out of the UK that will, I think, be a very powerful counter for these problems. Once again, though, it's only in the UK. I think there are going to be a whole lot of investigations. In fact, there's a hearing coming on March 25th where the tech leaders are going to have to show up, and they're going to start getting some hard questions from Congress about how their platforms work to harm their own users and others, right? Whether it's from hate speech, disinformation, misinformation, violence, et cetera, et cetera. That pressure is coming, and I would suggest that if you care about these issues, you vocalize that to your elected officials. It's really important to do that here in the United States because sadly they respond more to what happens here than they do in other places. I mean, I think about people who are, say, from the Roma community in Bulgaria and getting harassed horrifically online and have no chance of ever being able to really get these big platforms to change. So it's kind of up to Americans to put as much pressure as you possibly can. That's not a fair situation. That's a privileged situation for people like me, but we're here and we've got to do something about it. So hopefully those investigations will help. I'll also say the UN seems to be stepping up on this front. The UN Secretary General put out a statement about how horrible white supremacy is the other day, and they seem to be beginning to look at the online space in terms of this stuff. And maybe it takes a global agency to fight, companies that are global. I don't know, but at least these are the beginnings of something. I do know that if all of us keep speaking out, that makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. And Heidi, I really wanted to thank you for your time and your great work over these many years. And I know it seems like more battles to come in this fight for equality, this fight for justice, this fight for humanity to live together in harmony. And I know it's utopian and Pollyanna, but it's something to aspire for. And you're on the front line. So with a lot of respect, thank you for joining us and being with us and sharing with us your insight and knowledge.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. This is really wonderful. It's a thoughtful conversation. I greatly appreciate being here.